Okay,
He's
perfect.
working on it.
All right. It's so wonderful to welcome all of you here to this beautiful space that we call Innovation Headquarters. In many ways, this was Fiona's, actually in every way, this was Fiona's baby. The establishment of this entire building was a dream that she had, which was to really bring all of the innovation initiatives at MIT all in one space. And so we are based here on the 5th floor. And I just want to give a very special welcome to the Eisenhower Fellows. It was a long time ago when I was in your shoes, and I was also in the Women Leadership program. Wow. Yes, I was, and it was a phenomenal experience. And I just want to say that it was because of the fellowship that I did with Eisenhower that I'm actually here today at MIT. Wow. Not because during my fellowship I got to meet the amazing Dame Fiona Murray. That was not it. I met her a little later. But the purpose of my fellowship was to really understand. I had just been appointed as an economic advisor to the president of Egypt, and I had been given this task to create a national strategy for entrepreneurship and innovation. And I used my fellowship to really understand how different innovation ecosystems were built across the United States. And that was what opened up this whole entire space for me, and the importance of building strong ecosystems to support entrepreneurs. So in many ways, the Eisenhower Fellowship was a pivotal experience for me, and it opened up my eyes to a lot of different experiences here in the US that I could take back home to Egypt. And to the Sloan Fellows, welcome. We're excited to have you. I also remember what it was like when I did my own mid-career program, but I did it at the other university.
You took the best courses up here.
But that is when I met Fiona. So in many ways, it was that mid-career program that also kind of brought me to MIT. So it's wonderful to have all of you here. I did the Harvard mid-career program, as did Dina as well. She was the one who encouraged me. So I know there are a lot of Eisenhower Fellows who've kind of done both. But anyway, again, welcome to all of you. And I'm thrilled, delighted to be able to have this conversation with Fiona. Fiona has a very interesting story, at least for me. And I think it's a story that is important to share because I don't think it's easy for a woman to be in academia, to be in academia as an engineer in a school of management, and to work on issues related to innovation and entrepreneurship and risk capital, or the kind of intersection between innovation and security, because Fiona also sits on the board of the NATO Innovation Fund. She's also been focusing a lot of her time on deep tech innovation, and a lot of these spaces are very male-dominated. So to be a woman and to have that female voice is something that I wanted to bring out to all of you today. And so we're going to get started, but I do want you, I know that a number of you have already been thinking about questions that you want to ask Fiona, so we will have time at the end.
Happy to do that.
Yep, for all of you to ask questions to her and to bring up any issues that are really on your mind. I'm sure we would love to hear about some of the experiences also that you've had throughout your fellowship and what that has meant to you, and what the experience of being a part of a community of women has also meant to you. So I'm going to get started, and it's always fun to do this with you, Fiona. I thought we would just get started by you sharing with everyone a little bit about your own journey. I think for any woman and for anybody in any position of leadership, there are lots of ebbs and flows. Yeah. But for women in particular, I think the ebbs and flows are very extreme sometimes. I'd love for you to share a little bit.
At least there are some lows.
There are some lows, and then there are some highs. Yeah. But I think, when we are in those lows, sometimes it's hard to navigate because we don't have, our own tribe to help us navigate. And it's hard to also admit that you're in a low, in a space where everyone expects you to always never be in a low. But also, even when there are moments where you are high and you're doing really great things, I don't think that women are often celebrated in the way that they should be, even by our fellow women, right? So I would love for you to share a little bit about your own journey and a little bit about how you have navigated the ebbs and flows of that journey. The room.
All right. Gosh, so where to begin? I'm probably going to begin just before I started university. And one of the reasons I'm going to talk about that moment is because the starting of university is on my mind at the moment. As Dina knows, I have 2 children, a 17-year-old daughter and a 20-year-old son. My 17-year-old is in the middle of applying to university, and she's sort of navigating the complexity of making choices, thinking about how ambitious to be, deciding on some of the complexities of the American system, which asks you to make a specific bet on the place you most want to go to, with a thing that's called early decision, where they say, only do this if the place that you apply to is a place that you would like to have tattooed on your body, because you so want it. Because if you get in, you have to go. And that's quite stressful. And as a parent and a mother, and I think a role model to my own daughter, I simultaneously want her to aim high. I really, really worry about her not making it and being really upset, but I don't want that to stop her being ambitious. I also don't want to project my own, accomplishments onto her. So having, parents, a mother that has a number of degrees from very famous universities. I've had the privilege of getting an education from Oxford and then Harvard, and then I came here. It's quite a lot. It's quite a lot to carry, and it's a thing I simultaneously carry with pride, with a lot of humility. Sometimes I don't like to talk about it, and I've actually tried to learn to own my own accomplishments, and I think that's often quite difficult. And to sort of think through what that experience felt like for me. And for me, I think the decision, so I applied to Oxford. I was at an all-girls school, and my school didn't send very many young women to Oxford. It was quite difficult for women to get in. They were still very much in the minority. And I said to my teachers, and you had to do a very particular exam, so you had to get extra tutoring to do this exam. And I said, I want to apply to Oxford, I want to apply to do chemistry. And my teacher said, you'll never get in. I said, why not? And they said, well, nobody ever gets in from the school to do that. And anyway, you're not, in the top 3 who we think would get in. And I said, well, who is? And I sort of had an idea, and they told me who it was. And I thought,
3 men?
Well, no, all-girls school. So 3 girls. Interesting. And I thought, well, okay, I'm sure they're clever, but I think I'm just as clever as they are. And I thought to myself, I'm just going to show them that it can be done. And I think for me, that's been a story of a lot of my career, is people will say you can't do something. And my reaction is normally one of some amount of rage, some amount of just really, and kind of let me show you. Mm-hmm. And that has been a reaction I had with my parents. Let me show you that it can be done. It's quite a lot, though, baggage and quite a lot of sort of negative emotion to carry around with you. But it has been, for me at least, particularly in the early phase of my career, the sort of propellant, if you like, the kind of aerosol that sort of propels you to do the extra work for various things. And so, to cut a long story short, I went to Oxford to study chemistry. I went to a college, so Oxford is organised by colleges that had only just admitted women. And to read a subject that was very male-dominated. It continues to be. Chemistry is not a place where you find a lot of young women. But I found it to be actually really difficult, especially at the beginning. And it's hard when you have wanted something very badly. You've also wanted to prove something, and then you find it really difficult. And I spent quite a lot of time in my first year of college wondering whether it was for me. Feeling like an outsider in a variety of dimensions. I felt like an outsider as a woman in the lab. There were very few women, as I say, in the labs. Feeling like an outsider because particularly at the time at Oxford, science wasn't cool. I think nowadays that's a little bit different, and here on MIT's campus it is sort of the coolest thing you can do, engineering is. But at the time at Oxford, I was there a little bit after people like David Cameron and Boris Johnson, who became prime ministers, and what have you, Tony Blair and others, all of whom studied politics, philosophy and economics. And those were the cool people, or history, like my dear co-author, who I suspect is not here anymore, but Phil. That was what cool people did. And the chemists and the scientists were really considered like second-class citizens. So wrong subject, wrong gender, and then some odd social class dynamics that I think don't translate particularly well to another country, but definitely not a sense of belonging. And so right from the beginning, I really felt like an outsider. And sort of every part of my day, from getting up and going to lectures to going to the lab to then going back and washing my hair because it smelt of chemicals to going to a party, you sort of felt a little bit like an outsider. And for me, that's been a theme, if you like, of my journey. It's been some combination of feeling like an outsider, but also feeling like, well, I'll show you, I can do this. And every time I've made a shift in my career, whether it's been from my undergraduate and master's to coming over to the US to do a PhD, I chose to do a PhD in engineering, which is similar but not the same. To come as a Brit to America, so similar but definitely not the same. People think the US and Britain are the same, and I think Churchill famously said, divided by a common language. And then shifting from, US has good lines.
Very fair point.
Very fair point. And then really making a decision to become an academic, but in a school of management. So again, I've chosen to be an outsider, to bring, almost like saying I'm bringing news from some other part of the world, from some other intellectual sphere to you that I think will be very important. And in my most recent work, which is to really try to bring my insights and the insights of my team and others from innovation and entrepreneurship, from the sort of frontier of deep technology and the ventures that are getting created, to bring that news, if you like, into one of the most traditional industries in our economy, which is defense and security and sort of energy and infrastructure. That's also, in a sense, being an outsider coming with news. And I think to do that well requires a willingness to be an outsider and to almost sort of thrive in that outside experience, having a real willingness to speak up. But it does require, I think, quite a lot of internal self-belief. Mm-hmm. And for me, the lows are, well, I don't belong. Now, it's my choice, right? But on the other hand, in the moment, the lows for me are often feeling like you don't belong, not being able to work out how to sort of speak a language so that you can actually connect with people and make your point well, feeling as if you're not as accomplished as the people around you who've been in whatever space it is for a very, very long time. So sitting with investors who've done nothing but invest, even though I think a lot about and work on different investment structures. Coming into the defense and security world with people who've been in that world for their entire career, even though I bring something interesting, it requires, I think, a lot of energy and self-belief to not feel like you're just not quite up to it, or that you just don't belong and therefore you don't actually have a legitimate seat at the table. And I think that, for me, has been a very, the lows have been when that's just felt a bit much.
I'm pretty sure everyone in the room can relate to those moments of, I don't belong. Mm-hmm. Those are tough ones.
Yes.
But I think the tough ones are also, I can completely relate to people underestimating what you're capable mm-hmm. of, right? So I think, the Eisenhower Fellowship is a wonderful community of principle-driven leaders from across the world, but also in our own center, at the Legatum Center, we have these kind of cohorts and communities of entrepreneurs. And while we at the center haven't created something that is women-focused, we've created these also beautiful communities mm-hmm. of people across the world. How have networks and communities played a role, from your perspective, in advancing women's leadership in today's world? And if you think they haven't, that's also okay. But what strategies can you recommend for women to actually use these networks and leverage them mm-hmm. For their own progression?
Sure. So look, I think the first thing I'd say is that networks are extraordinarily important, right? The network of connections that we have to other people are very powerful. They are things that we can use in a whole variety of ways. And they're also places where we can give back to the other people on the other side of those things. I think in general, and I will keep saying this, in general, on average, because whenever I talk about the research on these things, if I say women do this or they experience that, All I mean to say is not that any one of you might find this to resonate with you, but rather what we know from very large-scale studies about the average female, as opposed to any one of you in particular. But we know that in general, women find networking more uncomfortable. If I say the word networking, many of you will have this sort of slightly visceral, like, that seems very transactional. If I say this to the average sort of, male executive, they'll say, of course. And a lot of that, I think, is how we think about the real sense of social interactions. And I'd like to think about our networks as a sort of social fabric, a kind of tapestry, if you like, that we sort of weave together the people who are in our lives. And some of those people we might see or talk to once or twice a year. Some of those people we might talk to once a week. Some we might talk to every day. And those things ebb and flow, I think, at the same time. And the thing that I think is really important is that, particularly for our professional purposes, all the people in our network don't have to be our friends.
Yeah.
We don't have to actually necessarily really like them, although it's easier when we do because it's easier to engage with those people. But if you think about it, if we're in a network with one another, if we're connected in some way, maybe by a third party or somebody else, if I need something, I might be willing to ask you. But what that does is that gives you a kind of a check mark, which means that, I owe you because I've asked you and you've done something for me. So actually, at some later time in the future, you sort of know that I can come back and ask, you can, come and ask me for something. I find that to be a little easier for us to think about these things. And I find it easier to think about the fact that I can and should, and I try to teach young women in particular to be a little more strategic, particularly women who join a new program. So I think about this a lot with our executive MBAs, think about it with our Sloan Fellows, and some of you have heard me talk about this, particularly when you join a new program. Of course, you're going to make friends on that program, people who I hope will be friends for life. But you also have this amazing opportunity to add new people to your network. And potentially some other people will be left behind. There are only so many hours in the day. But what is it you're trying to accomplish, and how might your network help you with that? I think is a very, very reasonable and good and strategic question. And we ought to be tending to that social fabric, that tapestry of connections, I think, on a regular basis. Until I started teaching this, I didn't actually think about this very much. And now I have to I find myself trying to actually take my own educational medicine. And I think about my own network sometimes. And occasionally I'll sit and try and make a particular effort to say, well, I'm trying to accomplish this. Who ought I to connect with? When I'm next on, say, a trip to London, who should I make the effort to have breakfast with, have coffee with, even though I know I'm tired? And I think it's the even though I know I'm tired. Yep. I would like to just put that, even though I know I'm tired.
How many heads are nodding? It's like, yep.
Yep, we all feel that. Right? And just to give you a really concrete example, and this is, those of you who are academics will know what this feels like, but there's an equivalent in everybody's career. To get tenure at a major American university, you need to have published a certain amount, but you also need a set of people who are high status, prestigious people in your field to write tenure letters that say, dear MIT tenure committee, I've read Fiona's work, it's amazing. In this field, she's the best news scholar. I'm comparing her to these other 10. She's the top one. Her research walks on water. Or she does, although the ideas are amazing. That's a really difficult thing to think about. But you only need about 10 people to say that. Only 10 people. And you have about 7 years to make that true. So you have to do the work. You have to write the papers. That's a thing. But we all have whatever the job entails. But what I realized at some point was that I needed to work out who that list was. And I then needed to make sure that when I went to conferences, I didn't just talk to my friends. I didn't just tend to the fun, nice social bit of my network. I made an effort to go and find a few of those people. And oftentimes be fairly straightforward and say, look, you're absolutely somebody whose work I admire. I'd really appreciate your guidance. Would you be willing to at least sit and talk to me about my work, or I'm about to give a presentation, or to go to those places? And particularly at the time, my children were quite small. And when I went to a conference, all I wanted to do was get room service and watch television. I just wanted to, I was so tired.
Go to bed.
I wanted to lie in bed in a hotel room, put the TV on, watch some terrible, American television program, and get a club sandwich, which is the only thing that hotels ever do reliably well. And I thought to myself, nope, you can do this, Fiona, but only once you've met these 3 people, you've hunted them down. And so I would sort of try and be strategic, even though I didn't particularly want to be. And it's really I think you have to, when we're so busy or have health issues or feel tired for whatever reason, I think being strategic about our networks is really important. Mm-hmm. And trying to work with people who give us energy. So I think our network, when we have choices, there are people we all can think of who just sap our energy. And trying to make sure we spend less time with them and more time with the people who are energy giving, who are sort of nourishing to our souls, I think is a very powerful piece of that.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. So, tough question. Has there ever been a time when you felt deeply let down by your community? And I assume the answer is yes, because it's hard to be a woman and not have been in that position. But sure. Maybe I would say, if the answer is yes, how did you rise? Like, how did you move on from that?
Sure. I mean, I think we always have experiences when we feel let down. I wouldn't say I've ever felt let down by a community of women, in part because until quite recently in my life, I would say that I didn't really feel like I had a community of women. I have one now, and that community has really been built of people, Dina, like you, of women who I've worked with, colleagues, co-authors, people who ostensibly work for me but really work with me. Yeah. And they have become sort of my community, I think, in a very powerful way. The places I felt most let down have not been by those people. It's really been in professional settings when there have been moments when I have felt as if I've been disrespected, ignored, treated in very negative ways, and that I have spoken up about that, and that in speaking up, I've not been taken seriously, or that people have found it too awkward, inconvenient, or just difficult, and the problem gets reframed as, you should fix whatever this issue is. Mm-hmm. And that made me feel deeply let down, and that was something that sort of unfolded over a period of time. And I, at the time, called on various of my colleagues and said, look, I'm a reasonable human, you've known me for quite a long time, this just doesn't feel supportive. And at the end of the day, I didn't feel like people did step up. And at some point, I came to peace with that fact. Subsequently, I have colleagues who were part of that, but who I've subsequently said to them, that was a really difficult time for me. And a number of them have now acknowledged that they didn't do a fantastic job. And so rather than doing what I would often do, which is to not have people feel uncomfortable, so I'd say, oh, it's fine. I didn't say that. I said, no, you didn't. Yeah. But thank you for acknowledging that. Yeah. And I hope that if this were to happen again to any one of us or another human in our community or our team, we would do something differently. And I really work hard at that because I think some of this is cultural, is not wanting people to feel uncomfortable. So the it's fine would be a very automatic reaction. I can't even tell you whether that's because I'm female or British or both. I hear my mother's voice telling me that everybody should be sort of not made to feel uncomfortable. And so I just sort of thought, no, I have to say, you didn't, and I really wish you had. But here we are, thank you for saying that, and now what can we do differently? And so it's been really important for me to have some recognition of some of those issues. And that's where I have felt let down. And so I try to speak up when I can.
I appreciate you sharing that. I'm sure everyone appreciates that. I want to talk to you or ask you a little bit about the concept of the double bind that we often find ourselves in as women. And I know that you talk about this in the executive education course that you teach on women leadership. And women, I feel like, are often stuck in this double bind within leadership roles, not knowing how to, are they supposed to step in and, just practice leadership like a man? or how can they practice leadership like who they are as they are? And then there's the whole kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't.
That's right.
Which is often the case anyway, so you might as well just do you, right?
Yes.
So how can women in leadership positions navigate the challenges of the double bind? And from your vast experience, but also in all the conversations that you've had with women in leadership positions through the courses that you've taught in executive education, what organizational changes are really needed to support women so they're not stuck in that mindset?
So the basic idea, right, of the double bind has to do with the fact that if you show up in your organization showing really, very significant levels of competence, and I find, a man who displays similar levels of competence, and I show some outside observer kind of a write-up of you and a write-up of him, what will often happen is that people will look at the write-up of you and say, incredibly competent, just not very likable. And they'll look at that from the man and go, incredibly competent, really hard charging. And all the psychological evidence, and we've done this with MBA students, we've run endless experiments of these things. And so what that means, right, is that in many ways women are expected to demonstrate all these leadership abilities and qualities, but do it with a kind of wrapper of likability. But if you're too likable, then you look incompetent. And so there's just and this is the double bind. And so the question becomes, what do any of us do? And I can tell you that it certainly is something that I've experienced, and I think, you've experienced.
Oh, yeah. Like on a weekly basis.
Right. And, the way it manifests itself, just to give you an idea, is I at one point did a 360, and I have a whole rant about what I don't like about 360s, but you sort of stand in the middle, almost invisibly, and a variety of people get to say anonymous things about you.
And then you get to read it all.
You read it all, which is very stressful. And then it's somehow yours to fix. And it doesn't acknowledge the fact that you are in a community and an organization that, and that many of the bits of feedback are somewhat gendered. And one of the bits of feedback I got was, Fiona is too competent. She speaks in full paragraphs. And I thought that was my job, but that's okay, and I'm sorry I'm competent.
How dare you?
Yes. And there was a little bit of sort of, she should be more warm and friendly. And I thought, I think I'm warm and friendly, but maybe, the Britishness, right? So there's a sort of, and I had the same experience with, they were training us to teach. And they talked about controlling your classroom. And this group of us were told to get our Zen mistress onto the stage to kind of control the classroom. And so we were doing this, and my colleagues were told to be warm and fuzzy, and all the women were told to have their Zen mistress on stage. And then I was doing my practice session, and I was told, this is terrible. You're very cold. You've got an ice queen on the stage. This ice queen is no good. You can't teach like this. And I said, but my ice queen is just a Zen mistress with a British accent. And so it's really all, and so there's this funny sort of issue about whether you don't seem friendly because British culture is a kind of cold culture in some way. And so I think it really is a double bind. And so then the question is, what do we all do about it? I think a few things. So my dear colleague Elspeth Johnson, with whom I teach this women's leadership program, says blue core, pink wrapper, by which she means really tough, but sort of friendly exterior. What does that really look like, and how do we manifest that? I think it's a lot about saying things like the team that I lead. So this is some of the ways that we often talk about this, is to, rather than to be endlessly, I did this, I did that. When women do that, it doesn't get well received. It's the team that I lead. So you sort of have to claim and say it's the team, which it always is. And some of it, I think, is just being authentically yourself. Yeah. I sort of think, so again, my young students will often say to young women, why do I have to do all this? It's so tiring. It's not authentic. And I said, yes, and we get to be, authenticity is about the bits of ourselves that we bring to any given moment, any given meeting, any given party, you know. And so finding various authentic parts of ourselves are ways, I think, in which we connect to other human beings. And so as I have got older and more senior, I find it, I mean, I did this even unconsciously at the beginning, right? I am happy to talk about my family. I never did that when I was younger, because it was sort of not quite acceptable to be having children and getting tenure and doing all that at the same time. That was considered sort of mad and not very professional. Now I'm a little older, my kids are older, it's easier for me to talk about them. They're also more interesting, so much more to talk about.
They really are interesting.
They are interesting. They're,
Very.
you know, they are good humans. Or I can talk about my dog, you know. So, and I don't do that. That is not a kind of conscious, oh, I must be nice to everybody or seem more approachable. It really is, you're getting the genuine me. But these are things that I think we've all learned over time. And also knowing when it's okay to just be tough. Mm-hmm. It's okay sometimes to just say, no, you know, we need to get this meeting sorted. And I've been learning how to step up in meetings, chairing things. What does it mean to be the chair on a board? What does it mean to have your voice heard? What does it mean to control a meeting? All of the things that as we get more senior and you end up serving on boards and other things, how do you do that differently? And that's been a learning experience for me.
I mean, I think owning your authority is a very, often a very tricky thing for a woman. And, you know, recently, not to name names, you know, you and I were referred to as extremely strong women with strong opinions who get things done, and that actually is a turnoff for people.
It was just annoying, I think. just a nuisance.
Think you and I just kind of completely brushed it off as, yeah, okay, we've heard that before. But actually, you know, this idea that people, when you do your job well, and when you do exercise the authority you have in a position you've been given, oftentimes you get judged negatively as a woman. And especially if, you know, you're composed.
Yes.
Heaven forbid you're composed, right? And I think it's just, it is definitely, I think, difficult to sometimes have to deal with these kind of, you hear these things and then you brush it off. Yeah. But somewhere it's internalized.
It is. And I think that in different settings, so one of the things I noticed, and you'll all notice how you cope with discomfort in professional situations and expectations, right? We feel discomfort.
I don't know how to cope.
No, what do we do, right? So one of the ways that we know that women deal with discomfort is to talk. In professional settings, that can come across as blethering, like brrr, right? And if you think about it, so if you measure in meetings how women speak, they tend to not draw breath, they speak for longer, and they don't quite know when to stop. And I see this in my classrooms, and it's especially noticeable on Zoom when you're teaching online, because you can almost sort of feel it, and you can feel the length of sentences and the length of comments and interventions. And my view is that there are two things that are driving that. Right? One is when women speak to each other, that's what they do, but they give each other the space to interrupt, you know, one another. Naturally, there's a sort of ebb and flow, and I think there's a very sort of historic and whatever set of things about that. Some of it's cultural, but a lot of it's not. Men interrupt and just sort of take bites of things and speak over each other and what have you. So when you put these things together, you get a sort of odd mismatch. And if you add to that being nervous, and many of us when we're nervous, voices go up and you just sort of say more. Those things, when you put them together, also make you come across as less composed and authoritative. And that becomes a kind of vicious circle. So one of the things I learned to do, and especially when I was public speaking, is when I get up on the stage, I mostly don't speak off a script when I give speeches and things. I learned to write out the first 3 or 4 lines, because otherwise I just sort of blab on at the beginning and think, oh, you kind of lost it there a little bit. And so I learned the first few lines. And I found the same in, you know, big meetings and big professional settings. NATO is a very formal organisation that I work with. There's something about how you begin to speak, and that makes you more calm.
Mm-hmm.
And you might be really nervous before you have to speak, if you've got your hand up or your thing up, but whatever it is. There's something about knowing what your first few lines are going to be that is really helpful in maintaining some sort of composure. And I think all of that is part and parcel of kind of owning that authority.
Yeah. Yeah. So why don't we talk a little bit about power and influence?
Let's do that.
Because I think women do bring very unique qualities,
Mm-hmm.
and if we really tap into those can manifest in a way that creates influence. If we really learn to play around with these things that are unique to women.
Mm-hmm.
So what, from your perspective, are effective ways that women can really amplify their voices, but also amplify traits that are unique to us as women? How can they harness their voice and those traits to achieve power and influence?
So look, I do a lot of work around innovation. That's a big part of what I study, how I work with organizations. And one of the things I remind people of is that very little innovation is done by individuals in a room alone. Now, the historical narrative about innovation is, in fact, just that. It's about genius men sitting in bathtubs, right, and things all under, apples falling on people's heads, and they're always alone, and they're always in a bath or under a tree. Right, funny things are happening. Right? And they've just had this moment of genius.
The epiphany that just fell on.
Exactly. And I hate that, right, because we all know that that's just not true. That some of our most creative work and ideas and happenings happen when we are talking and engaging with other people. That's true for men too. They just don't tell their story that way. It was always about them in the middle of their bathtub in their story. And so I think what we know is that it's about having diverse collections of humans that actually allow us to do more innovation. So at the very least, as women, we do bring a diverse perspective. And we're often much more open to the diverse perspective of others. We know not all men are the same, so we want to hear the different male voices in the room from different backgrounds and so on. We know that women, on average, are much better able to bring different voices into a conversation. That's a massive superpower. Because if you're just the one broadcasting, you're absolutely going to lose all these other possible ideas. And so I think there's a real power to that ability to draw out the ideas and the insights of others. That is probably one of the most powerful things. It's incredibly useful in an innovation context, and frankly, the innovation context, I think, is one of the most important that most of our organizations, whether they're startups or investment funds or large organizations, really are trying to grapple with today. And so most of the evidence also shows that women are uniquely placed to be really effective at leading innovation teams, not just being members of them. Because these innovative teams, if you've got people with very different backgrounds, and it doesn't matter, it's just lived experience, right? We all walk, it's hard to walk in somebody else's shoes, and people who've had different journeys bring something unique. But those diverse teams, the evidence shows us, they are either the most high performing or the worst performing, because the friction either turns into light and amazingness or heat, and there's massive conflict. And in general, we know that women are very good at dealing with these diverse points of view, and so that, I think, is an amazing place to try to bring some of these very unique skills, is the collaborative set of skills and how we use that in innovation.
Well, since we're talking about innovation, you recently became a member of the board of the NATO Innovation Fund. In fact, you're the vice chair of the fund, right? And
Yes.
When we think NATO innovation, or when we think NATO, immediately we think military, and I think oftentimes the visual is men. Men with weapons, when men, wars, that's
Men going to war.
Men going to war. These
Indeed.
visuals come up. And I would love for you to share with the room why you chose to get involved in the NATO Innovation Fund and how the voice of women like you is making a difference in shaping the strategic direction of innovation priorities within the defense and security space.
Sure. So I think if you look at where all the capital in the world is going when it comes to innovation and startups, the sort of iconic ideas and the iconic sort of image that we have is that all that money is going to startups in Silicon Valley. And many, many of those startups are doing interesting things, but they're often helping us, get a new ride share. They're helping us get online with, Instagram or something else. They're mostly about software, and they're a lot about consumers. And they are absolutely creating some value. But in the last several decades, or maybe 15 years, I've worked a lot on how we get capital to what I would call missions that matter. Right? The missions in the world that actually matter to us as human beings. And the first sort of part of that journey for me was how we do that in the life sciences and how we make sure that we think about creating new markets for things like malaria drugs or vaccines or whatever it might be. The second sort of phase of that journey for me was about allocating more capital into climate, and in particular how we get catalytic capital from family offices and foundations into the sorts of very, very deep tech, really roll up your sleeves, science and engineering startups that can make a transformative difference to climate, to energy storage, and to our ability to no longer be dependent on certain kinds of energy sources. And so I'd been doing that work for quite a long time when NATO came to see me, a bunch of people from the innovation team, and said, we really want to get more capital into startups to focus on defense and security. And we think that's a mission that matters. And we think that we need a really different way of thinking about it. We don't just need the big old companies to do this and our rather traditional military. We absolutely are committed to doing things differently. And it was after sort of 2014, so after the first sort of the annexation of Crimea by the Russians. And it was at a time when you were beginning to see a sort of hint of complex geopolitics and a world that clearly was having and going to have massive amount of significant challenge in defense and security. And so I said, all right, it's both an interesting intellectual puzzle. It's really focused on some of the technologies that I think are extremely important. And I think it's a mission that matters. And so I started to work with them in that. Fast forward, the fund has been established. It's a €1 billion fund. We have 24 NATO countries as the sovereign contributors, so 24 sovereign nations. Each nation is a limited partner, and we have a board that sort of sits between the nations and the investors to make sure that the investors hold the mission closely that we care about, which is not a mission just to maximize returns. It's also a mission to make sure that things are adopted, but to make sure they're adopted in a responsible way, and to also make sure that the ideas, the intellectual property are protected from adversarial capital. And so that was the first part of the story. And Dina, you ask a very good question, how can you be sure that this is a very male-dominated world. War is not a thing any of us want to have. Mm-hmm. I've come to the belief that I'm a deep believer in ESG and the Sustainable Development Goals, but I'm also a deep believer, as I think all of us are, in peace. Mm-hmm. And sometimes you don't have peace without winning a war. And sometimes you have peace when you can prevent a war, and that is a much better situation. And we need to be able to have reconstruction in ways that are also entrepreneur-led. And Dina, you and I have talked about this at length, which is how can we do that in ways that bring the most novel ideas and not the sort of usual suspects. And so part of my work has been to really work with the fund to think about how should we define the categories of what the fund is investing in. So we talk now about defense, security, and resilience. And that word resilience is really important, right? Comes from material science. It means a material that's resilient can kind of bounce back after a shock, after an impact of some kind. And so it's the same thing. How do we actually create societies, infrastructure, industries, supply chains that are kind of resilient and thoughtful? And so I really wanted us to emphasize those things. And that has led us to a set of conversations about resilient energy supplies that allow us to be less dependent and less sort of directed by where the energy is, where the oil is, and so on, or the natural gas, about security and resilience of food supplies. I mean, one of the things that I think shocked everybody after the sort of the significant invasion of Ukraine in 2022 was the fact that there was a food crisis in Egypt.
Yeah.
I don't think anybody, if you'd said to people, where does most of the food or the wheat in Egypt come from? Unless maybe if you were Egyptian, you knew.
Maybe, and probably not,
But
actually.
possibly not. Nobody knew that it all came from Ukraine and that suddenly we were massively dependent. When a water supply is completely, is poisoned for some reason, nobody thinks about the fact that we are hugely dependent on the resilience of those things. When undersea cables get cut and we can't communicate anymore, or somebody switches off their satellite, we're massively dependent. And so this idea of resilience, I think, is for me, it's become a quite animating kind of idea. And it's the way that I think about really how we need to direct capital in large amounts, not just early stage investing, but ultimately growth investing. And so our team are not just excellent investors, but they are individuals who also take the protection of the companies and the ideas and the people very seriously. And we take responsible use extremely seriously. It's a very difficult area. What does responsible use mean when you're starting to invest in things that can be used for good or for bad? But frankly, everything can now. If wheat shipments can be used effectively as a weapon, then everything is a weapon.
Yeah, of course. It's a very different world today.
Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit, before we open it up for questions, and I really appreciate you sharing your thoughts around the NATO Innovation Fund. I think it was, I personally haven't had the chance to hear that part from you, so it was really good to hear. But I think when people look and they see Fiona Murray, they see the Associate Dean of Innovation at the Sloan School of Management at MIT, they see the PhD from Harvard, they see, a member of I don't know which board, and you've achieved a lot in your career, but when I see you, I don't see that as just your sole identity, right? Because I see you as an incredible mother. I see you as a wife, as a friend, and to me, my boss, but you're also my women are so many things at the same time. And back in 2012, Anne-Marie Slaughter wrote this piece, very controversial piece in the Atlantic, and it was called "Why Women Still Can't Have It All." And so many women, I'm sure many women in this room are doing many things at the same time and trying to have it all. So my question to you is, do you think we're any closer as women to being able to have it all?
So I don't think we can have it all at any given moment in time. So I think Anne-Marie Slaughter is still correct. It's extremely difficult to try to manage the facets of our lives. For me, at least, I think for many of us, the thing that we trade off in the moment is probably ourselves and our health. And I have certainly been guilty of that. So, how do I manage to do everything that I do, which isn't everything, but it's a lot. I mostly do it by doing all my NATO and other European work at 7 a.m. So I do, or sometimes 6 in the morning.
7, Fiona?
Yes.
You mean 5, maybe?
Yes, early. I think, I can do that for 3 hours, and then I can do my normal job. And I do that, and both of our work requires sometimes things in the evening and so on. And the thing that probably does get traded off is health, right? It's sleeping well. It's trying to remember to eat healthfully. That takes a long time. All those sorts of things. Getting your exercise, walking, and just being, I think. And I think that, and especially where even exercise becomes like a chore that you have to sort of check off. I think that's the not having it all. I think the trade-off for many of us has been in just wearing ourselves down. And so I think that is for me at least, that's a work in progress, and I think that's true for many women. I think this discussion often gets framed around children. I think that's an important thing, but it's also our parents. And I just don't want to underestimate that. I think it's many of us have kids, many of us don't. But we have people in our lives that we have to care for. Yeah. And that's really important, whether it's, siblings or parents. And I think those things are definitely underappreciated. I actually think especially not children, any of the other people in our lives. I'm really struck by that. And I think that's particularly difficult as many of us live quite international lives and we're very far from our parents. I'm very far from my mom in England, and that really, that makes me worried, and I feel like I probably trade off always being the best daughter I could be because I'm also tired. And so, there's a sort of, and you keep thinking, well, I'll ring her tomorrow and I may have to show her this video and be like, really sorry. I'll ring you tomorrow.
This is what I was doing.
Yes. And so I don't think we can have it all. What I will say is that perhaps all of us can get better at imagining there are ebbs and flows. The place where I think we've seen improvement is in organisations being more willing to think about people having different kinds of careers, that as we no longer are trying to sort of go up a ladder in one organisation, that careers are more like portfolios where you move from one thing to another. You can sort of do a very high-powered job, let's call it an intense job with a lot of travel. You can then pick something that perhaps is a little less. And that doesn't mean that you've somehow exited the workforce. I do think that the more flexible job market, along with the more flexible pensions and all the sort of financial apparatus that goes along with it,
It's going to help women.
is helping. And I think it differentially helps women. It doesn't make it easy. And at different times we'll have different priorities. I wouldn't change my choices about wanting to be a wife and a mother, a daughter, a friend, and the owner of a very lovely dog who is now the love of the entire family's life. And those are really important things. But to say that everything gets kind of shoved into a certain number of hours would absolutely be true. And I keep hoping that soon I shall get more rest, but I haven't worked out when that is.
What are you talking about? Women aren't allowed to be tired.
That's also true, yeah.
Okay, it's my last question. Are you ready?
Of course.
Okay, I want to talk about the color pink.
Ah, yes, yes. The chairs, you see.
So, when I came to work at MIT and work with Fiona, I tend to wear dark colors, stick to grays, blacks. And Fiona would come in wearing these bright colors, or she'd give a speech be wearing, very bright pink colors. And I'd always be like, wow, this is interesting. But I know that this is a very strategic decision that you made to, when you're in a public event, wear very bright colors. And you and I have talked about this, and now I often do that too. But why don't you share with the women in this room the importance of, using color to own your space?
Yes. So if you came into my house, it's quite unusual today. I walked in and said, I'm not wearing pink. And Haytham and Donovan said, well, that's good, because the chairs are pink. And they were like, pink overload. So somehow you just sort of knew, or you rang Danielle and my assistant and found out. So I do have some pink in my bag and a scarf. But if you came into my house and opened my closet, you would see a very large chunk of it has a lot of very bright pink and sort of red and coral coloured shirts. And some of that started a little bit in COVID, actually, when we all spent all of our time as a little square on television, on a screen. And I used to sit there thinking, gosh, I sort of feel like everybody's faded into the background. And particularly when I was speaking and was teaching, I thought, well, the students need to be able to find me in this sort of game of squares, right? And so if I wear a bright shirt, everybody will know I'm here. But any of you who've done any sort of television and media know you can't wear a patterned shirt, right? Because that doesn't work, apparently. And so I took to wearing the pink or orange. I'd also say that orange has been my favourite colour since I was a child. My mother will tell you when I was allowed to pick my own carpet when we moved house when I was 4, I picked a really ugly shade of kind of like nylon orange that was probably quite flammable and terrible. But so I've always liked to be drawn to sort of bright things and colour. Colour has amazing chemistry. I mean, there's a very interesting history of sort of these bright colours. But Dina's mother liked my pink shirt when we were doing these Zoom calls. Her mum would be joining for our online seminars during COVID. And it sort of became something that I thought was important to sort of be able to be visible in front of a classroom, in front of a screen. And I realised, particularly when I walk into very large meetings in places like NATO, you have all sorts of men with their uniforms on, suits and so on, which is another form of uniform. And because most of them are much taller than I am and what have you, I realized that I felt quite invisible. But I discovered that if I wore, a pink jacket or a pink dress or a bright color, that at least they couldn't ignore me completely. I would be in their eye shot, even if they didn't want to hear what I had to say. And I found that to be oddly empowering. And actually, if you look at women like Margaret Thatcher, Christiane Lagarde, if you look at the pictures of the lineup of sort of the G7 or the G20 or whatever it might be, you actually almost always find that the women leaders will dress brightly because they're often shorter so they can be seen. And in fact, what I then realized when I was then reading about this and people's choices is that Her Majesty the Queen, also did the same thing. Mm-hmm. She always dressed, right? She had these extraordinary hats.
Bright colors.
There was a bright coloured hat and the dress. I mean, it was full on, the shoes, the whole thing, from top to bottom. And she basically is purported to have said that when people came, they wanted to see her, and she felt very obliged that they could find her in the crowd because there were so many people. Now, I have no aspirations of royalty or grandeur, but I feel like it's important when you want to try and own your space and your existence for people to be able to see you and to acknowledge your presence. I also find it quite uplifting just as a sort of matter of what am I going to wear this morning. Mm-hmm. So, not this morning, but in general. Partly that's because it was cold. Here we are, yes, pink.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to open it up for questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand high, and a mic will find you.
Thank you.
Can we take 2 questions, and then we'll do 3 rounds?
Okay.
Hi, my name is Zaiga. I come from Latvia. First of all, I want to thank you both for very good questions and very interesting answers. And I have 1 comment and 2 questions. So first of all,
only 1 question. We have a 1-question rule at the center.
Okay. One question, 1 comment.
Then I will start with a question about genders. Like you were talking about that you also worked in an environment with male-dominant environment. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to ask, like, you were telling that sometimes you felt that it's difficult or invisible or something. And I wanted to ask, don't you think that we all know that sometimes we have to power through or prove ourselves, like on, I would say, even on daily basis, not weekly basis. And what we talked, that it gets a bit tiring. And sometimes I feel that I'm more into politics and network, or how do you call that, more than in content. Mm-hmm. So my question would be, how do you get from the politics, in quotes, to the content and step out of this power fight that we have each day? And the other thing is, I wanted to say that women don't need to have it all. We just, both genders can share it all. And that would be the shift, that we don't have to think how we can do everything. We have to think how both partners can do the job that we have. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
We'll take another question. Up here? Oh, you have it. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Especially for sharing experience.
Can you introduce yourself?
Oh, yeah. I'm Yiting from China, and I'm working as an investor of the very early stage startups in techniques. So a lot of interesting common, like innovation, deep tech, capital, and I do find very few female in like STEM tech startups, and I think very few female get funded. So I think that's the question I really want to ask you, because no matter in China or in US, I do found that there's very few female in this domain, and also for the ones who are there, it's very unlikely they will get funded. I found a lot of efforts has been made on solving that problem, but yet the progress is
We don't see
really
results.
slow.
Got it. We know that. We know that.
Yeah,
we
so
we
it's
talk about this all the time.
All right.
Yeah, so I'm very interested in your opinion and how we are able to like have a possible way to navigate out of this problem. Thanks a lot.
Brilliant. Okay, so 2 questions and maybe a comment or a comment with a question mark on the end. So tiring, yes. I mean, part of the have it all, share it all is that even if everything was done sort of equally and men did their share of this, that, and the other, and women did theirs, because of the double bind, women would have extra work to do because the workplace just experiences women differently. And so it is tiring. I wouldn't want to pretend otherwise. I think it's really important, though, to focus on the work, but just to realize that the work doesn't speak just for itself. So I think it has to be an and both. I think being excellent at what any of us do is really important, and learning how to talk about it, getting credit for it, having allies who talk about it, so having other people who acknowledge it and acknowledge you is important. And so if I was to focus on how I would want to use my network or my allies, I would want to make sure I use the politics, if you like, to make sure that those people are supporting me even when I'm not in the room. And I think that would be the way I try to think about that for myself and the women who I try to advise. With the women, capital allocation, absolutely. The numbers are still depressing. They're depressingly low. If you do lots of experiments, I mean, women just don't look the part. Now, the more we see more women and celebrate the success of female entrepreneurs as well as male entrepreneurs, the better off we are, because then it just seems more normal. What I will say is that I think the only way to solve the problem is to have more women as capital allocators. So what you can see from the numbers is that when women are the ones being the investors, they are much more likely to invest in women-led businesses. If you ask them why, say, do you have a preference? They say, absolutely not. But it's their network. They just know more women, so more women come and pitch to them. And they have some bias, still we know that from the evidence, and so what that means is you have to put more money in the hands of women to be capital allocators, and that means we need to make sure that funds get built where women are the general partners. Engine Ventures up the road has Katie Ray as the managing general partner. If you look at their portfolio, even in the deepest of deep tech, they have a much more diverse portfolio on every dimension. It's very interesting. Katie didn't set out to do that, but it's just what she sees and what she's done. And so I think we've over-focused on the female entrepreneurs, and we have to focus on the female capital allocators and on the limited partners who are allocating the money down. So we have to get right back to the source of the money. Share it all, as I've said, I think there's both. So first I just want to acknowledge that not all of us are in sharing situations, and so, we sort of have to try and work out what we want from us for ourselves in whatever kind of context we find ourselves. It's obviously important that we have the people around us sharing and supporting whatever the nature of our partnerships, gender, whatever. But I still think it's hard because we're all trying to do so much, right? It is the kind of intergenerational, it's too much, but there's also, I think, there is a gift of having that choice. And this is a conversation I've had at great length with my daughter, who was particularly struck in one of her classes at school, where they were looking at a documentary about young women in Afghanistan who were no longer able to go to school, whose voices are no longer able to be heard. And she said to me at one point in the college admissions chaos, she said, but I try hard to remember that it's a privilege to just be able to fill in a college application and to have the absolute fulsome support of every single family member and community. And I think it doesn't make it easy to be tired, but it's a privilege to have this problem in a way. And I just sort of occasionally I sort of step back and think, gosh, not sure that was a privilege that was afforded to my mother or grandmother or great-grandmother.
Yeah. 100%. One, we'll take.
Okay, I'll try and give shorter answers.
Yep.
Note to self.
Should I start?
Yes.
Yeah, thanks so much for the very thoughtful discussion. I'm Lisa. I'm from Singapore. I I'm in a biotech company doing antibody-based therapeutics.
Brilliant.
I really enjoyed your life story around both being an outsider and, you know, showing them that it can be done. I had a question about being an outsider and trying to enact change. How did you build allegiances? How did you negotiate that process? Because you do need stakeholders within to help support that process. Thank you.
Thank you.
Question back here.
My name is Nara. I'm Sloan Fellow. So very nice to meet you. Thank you very much. I have a question. Like 11 years ago, you with your colleagues, you published, I think, that wonderful article, which I need to read because I think that the name of the article speaks for itself. It says, entrepreneurial attraction, investors prefer entrepreneurial ventures pitched by attractive men, where you really say that not just allocation is different, and you really was one of the first who said only 7% of the ventures backed by VC actually go to the woman. But the second thing that investors, they really prefer attractive men, but for women it doesn't matter. So
It's true.
we are working on our venture, and I just wanted to know, to be voiced and to be heard by VC, by ventures, as a woman, what we need to do.
So let me take that
Can
first
we take one last
Yeah,
question?
one last one. Whatever.
Sorry, we're going to go here and then we'll wrap up. Sorry.
So, thank you so much, Fiona. This is it's not a trick question, but I really want to hear your perspective. How do we innovate in leadership? Oh, sorry, my name is Bosse. Sorry. My name is Bosse. I'm from Nigeria, and I run a nonprofit focused on women's leadership. So I really think that there's a leadership crisis globally, and I'm really curious to hear from you how we innovate in leadership.
That's not a trick question, but that's a hard question.
It's a tough one.
That's a good one.
That's
but,
a
you
tough
know,
one, Bosse.
I like that. So let me see whether I can. Let me start with the research article. So you're absolutely right. 2014, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. I was very proud of publishing there. Those of you who have an academic sensibility will know that's a good place to publish.
Very good.
Hard to publish. So that was my main check. So that was an experiment that was inspired by a set of experiments that were done by the Boston Symphony Orchestra by Harvard professors. And they basically noticed that very few women were first violinists, and they wondered about why not. And so they did the auditions behind a screen. And we know that once the auditions were blinded, including making people take their shoes off because high heels have a very giveaway sound, more women were selected. And so I said, well, how about we do this in entrepreneurship? But of course, you can't do an entrepreneurial pitch, as you know in your startups, all of you, behind a screen. So he said, well, what can we do? And I said, all right, why don't we just can take a video of the slides and you just hear the voice, and then we can dub the voice male and female. And so we dubbed the voice of the script. It was literally the verbatim script. And then we asked people, is this convincing? Would you invest? Is it investable? And what we found is that same words, same slides, male voice, more convincing to men and women. That's the sad bit of that paper, actually, which we sometimes forget about. And then I have a co-author who's had done lots of work. She's at Harvard Business School about attractiveness and negotiation. And so she had this whole set of these pre-coded images coded for attractiveness. And so we sort of added these photographs sort of just to see. And it turned out there's this hugely strong attractive male effect. Now, I think if you think about it, so what my own view about this is that when you're trying to make choices under decision-making under uncertainty, uncertainty is the gap between kind of what you know about something and what you're trying to guess. And in those gaps, we tend to put bias because we've got nothing else to put in there. And so I think automatically as humans, that's what we do. And so we pick people who sort of look the part because we think, well, we couldn't go wrong with that, could we? So why wouldn't we? Why wouldn't we say that's more convincing? Because that person looks sort of how the most convincing humans in the world apparently look. That's probably one of the most depressing pieces of research I've ever done. It got a lot of coverage in part because of the nice title. And I think the answer to that is a few things. So one is, I think the most important answer is the more women pitch, the more that becomes normal. And so the more the gap of sort of I don't know, do you look the part? It's all about this who looks the part. I think that the more we see women entrepreneurs, the more there are women who are successful, the more we celebrate that, the more women pitch like you, the less that happens. The other thing that I think is really important is we have to come when we pitch with very clear evidence. And we do, again, we have to work harder. It's more tiring. You just have to be very evidence-based, very clear and very calm. And at the end of the day, I think this will really change when more women are allocating capital. I genuinely think that that is going to be the thing that makes the difference. When it comes to stakeholders, I actually think, again, that's not something that women are always good at, because we have to remember those are networks of support that we have to build, and we're often, I think, in a position where we think, oh, I must do it all myself, which is tiring. So why not get other people to support? I've certainly learned to do that on the boards I've sat on. Some of my instinct is to do it myself, but that's because that's what I've always done, and I have to learn new behaviours. And so I've had to try and make allies of other board members, male and female. And that has been really important for me on the NATO Innovation Fund board. It's a lot of work. And so really kind of recognising the skills and expertise of my colleagues, building up relationships with them, seeking their advice, getting their input, is something that I've sort of had to learn and not just do it all myself. And then innovating in leadership. Look, if I could change one thing about leadership and leaders, it's to reduce corruption. I mean, if there's one thing I could change in the world, it would be corruption. If I could make that go away, I feel like I could solve a tremendous number of problems. And so I'd like to think that as we think about leadership, we really talk about the fact that as leaders, and particularly in politics, political leaders and so on, across the world, that in many places, I think people use leadership positions of power for themselves. And that's human, I understand that, but it's so destructive that I would like us to innovate in leadership to put that front and center. I think we have to also think about what we mean by leadership and make sure that as we teach, we really think about the fact that what are the stories we tell? Who are the people that we show? I really don't want to sit through another leadership lecture where the dominant example is Steve Jobs. It comes back to who looks the part, and absolutely a genius of innovation, of understanding customers and so on, but there are many other versions of leadership, and I just don't think we pay enough attention. There's too many leadership lectures, or even when we show slides or covers of magazines that will revert to something that's easy and understandable. And so I would really like to innovate in having a much richer set of role models, and what we mean by leadership, I think, has to be, transformed.
So I'm going to ask one last question, and then we'll network or eat or, go rest. I am a firm, we talk a lot about the patriarchy and the need, you were talking about one thing that really needs to end is corruption. And we find ourselves, I think this upcoming election in the US is like really, really critical. And it's not just about, do we love Kamala versus Trump or whatever, but in many levels, it's about, can we rid ourselves of the patriarchy and that need to see that white male in a position of leadership. But the reality is the patriarchy exists in all of us, men and women alike. And we don't talk about that a lot. We think patriarchy, we think we have to, it's all about men, but it's also about women really also working on themselves to remove the patriarchy that has also been deeply ingrained within us, because we're all a part of the same system.
Yes.
And we forget about that. We are truly all a part of the same system. And so in this space of women leadership, we end up always talking to women. Here, this is a room full of women, but this was actually intentional. We always find ourselves talking to women, but we don't ever talk to women about their own biases that have been kind of what society has put inside of us, because we were all raised in a patriarchal system. No matter where we were in the world, whether it be Britain or the United States or Egypt or China, the patriarchy prevails.
It's alive and well.
Alive and kicking, for sure. And maybe it's kind of slowly trying, on its last breath, we don't know, but it's not going to be removed without women also addressing it. So what would be your thoughts on how we as women can really work on ourselves, but also on the men in our lives, to have that at the forefront and really catch ourselves when we fall into that trap of the patriarchy and the biases that we've all kind of learned just from growing up in that system.
Yeah. I mean, I think as you say, Dina, those biases are alive and well. The evidence from that paper says women also will hear those pictures and pick the attractive man. So that tells us everything that we really need to know. And I think we have to sort of catch ourselves, right? It is a matter of consciousness. How am I responding in a particular situation? Who am I walking across a room to talk to? Right? When I'm in class, when I'm calling on people, am I sort of being even-handed in some way around those things? I sit at home. Do I have different expectations of my son or my daughter? In my household, traditionally, my son, or at least my husband, was referred to as Pasha, right, which means prince in many languages, including Turkish. And my daughter sometimes complains that when she sees the family, people say to her, "Oh, you're so beautiful." And when my son appears, they say to him, "Oh, you're so clever." And I think for me, that is like the manifestation from the people who love us most. And so I think very hard about that. And I both engage in a corrective, which I do every time. I'm not sure correcting, 90-something-year-old grandparents is particularly useful, but she has to see me do that. But I also have to sort of do it in myself. And so I think there's just a sort of a consciousness, and there's a consciousness for the men around us. We actually know that men who have daughters are much, much more likely to have more women on their leadership team and preside over a very different kind of an organization. So having daughters makes it much, much more real. And so there's something quite interesting about that. But I think it's like a daily work that we have to do. And I think we have to help every generation do that. And I worry actually sometimes that things are getting worse, not better. And so I really am hopeful that we can continue to do that work. It's very important.
Wonderful note to end on, Fiona. Thank you so much for taking the time.
It's my pleasure.
To speak to everyone.